Hi, welcome back to SQL in the City. Hopefully you're ready for a great day of learning. I'm Steve Jones, the founder and editor of SQL Server Central, and I also work as an evangelist here at Redgate Software. And I'm honored that I get to give the keynote here for our first SQL in the City of 2018. We've got more coming throughout the year, and we hope you'll join us for all of them. Now, a couple weeks ago, I was scanning through the news looking for interesting stories that I want to put in Database Weekly. This is something that I do a few times a month, and it's an exciting part of my job because I get to kind of take the pulse of what's happening in the world, what different things are going on, what interesting stories are occurring. And I get to see lots of database and SQL Server related posts. And what I find is that many of them are variations on just a few different themes. For example, there's often new products being released or new features in SQL Server. These days, Azure SQL Database gets features first, and so it seems like Microsoft is regularly making changes to either the platform or Management Studio or something else. It's also true at Redgate. We release 5, 6, 7 different versions every single week. I scan the Slack channel and I constantly see new updates coming through, new features being released to customers, and it's a challenge to keep up. But also, one of the common themes is solving problems in code, right? Writing T-SQL, or these days writing the R language. Hopefully some of you will adopt Python as well, and we'll start to see more of those articles. People explain, how do they solve an error occurring in their system? How do they write more efficient code? How do we change configuration, tune something up so that everything just runs a little bit smoother? It's something we're all concerned about. But there's another theme that comes up probably far too often, right? That's the issue of security or data breaches. And a couple weeks ago when I was looking through the news, I ran across a story that surprised me. And it shouldn't have, right? Because I'm a little desensitized to these topics. Every single week it seems like there's been some new data breach or some security problem that's come up. And I just see them all the time, so usually I'm not surprised. Now, last year, Equifax reported their own data breach where they talked about losing a huge number of records for people all over the world, and my surprise was only that the number was so low. I would have expected that Equifax lost all of their data. As a matter of fact, that's what I was telling people they should just assume for safety's sake. Now, since those initial reports, Equifax has come back and said they underreported that loss, so I was probably right to be a little pessimistic. Now, in this case, FedEx actually announced the data breach. And as you can see here in the slide, they had data available in a public Amazon S3 bucket. And this was real customer data. It was over 100,000 records, which is a fairly small breach, but it was scanned customer data like passports and driver's licenses and other personally identifiable information. And apparently this had been exposed for years by a company that FedEx had actually purchased. Now, I don't know why I thought this was surprising. I mean, I thought FedEx was probably a little bit better at security. They're cutting edge. They invest a lot in technology to run their entire business. And we trust them. They're a third-party shipper that we trust to deliver packages securely and intact to their destination. And I kind of assumed they would do a better job securing all their data, but apparently that's not the case. Now, I shouldn't be surprised, right? Any large organization like FedEx, even medium-sized organizations like Redgate, were made up of individuals. And we all know that the weakest link, the least competent technician, or the person that's trying to get work done and they're rushed, or they're in a hurry, or they're being pressured, they often choose to place convenience over security. And when they do that, that one time that they just let security lapse can and often will open the door for some kind of disaster. And many of us have worked in at least one company. Some like me have worked in multiple companies, and we see that the skill or the care or the dedication or the talent can vary widely from person to person inside the company. And we're not a homogeneous monolith here, where each of us is different. And even for those of us that think we're competent or experts at our job, the care we take can vary from day to day or week to week, month to month. We get busy, we get harried, we may be sick or have other items that distract us. And that one time we forget about security or we do something in a hurry, that one time that we're rushed, that could be the time that we let data escape. Now, in this case, FedEx didn't have fundamental problems in their system. They didn't have fundamental flaws or architects. They purchased a company, but they didn't perform enough due diligence. No one at FedEx checked thoroughly to ensure that this company was properly handling all their sensitive data. I don't expect this to continue. Right? I don't expect this to happen in the future because I think anybody that purchases a company from this point forward, they purchase a startup or they purchase an existing company, they're going to perform due diligence to ensure that company has handled their PII data appropriately. They haven't exposed anything, they don't have any data breaches out there. In fact, I think it's likely that all future sales will require the seller to escrow some funds or be financially responsible for future data breaches. I know I've had responsibilities when I've sold a company before. I expect that to move into the data area, and we'll actually start to put a price on the risk of mishandling data in many of our contracts. Now, the problem with data breaches and losing data isn't really new. We've seen plenty of problems across the last decade. As I mentioned, Equifax last year lost personal information. They initially reported 143 million Americans, Canadians, UK citizens. We now know that that's greater, so it's some number north of that. River City Media had a backup issue, and they lost 1.3 billion with a B email addresses and other PII data. And then Yahoo lost over 3 billion of their accounts. Matter of fact, I still get spam emails from people that maybe still use Yahoo or that they haven't used Yahoo in years, but they come from that data breach where somebody is phishing and trying to get information. And for many of us as individuals, it's kind of become a question of when, not if, there'll be a breach of our data. I know I expect to replace my credit card every year. Many of you may do the same thing. You expect you may deal with some sort of credit issue, some identity theft at some point in the future. It's just becoming the new norm. And that's worrying that we expect data breaches to be the new norm. The Identity Theft Research Council, they've been tracking data breaches for over a decade. So I went back and looked at some of the information to see how the trend is going. Now in 2005, which was their first year, there were 157 incidents. So a little less than one every other day occurred throughout the year. And those were the ones that were reported and tracked. Halfway through their data set in 2011, there were 421. So a little over one a day. But that was actually a down year from 2010 and 2012. If we go to last year, 2017, there were 1,500 data breaches, a little bit over that, which was a 44% increase over 2016. 2018 is on pace to actually become another record year. Now the totals across that time, over 8,600 incidents, losing 1 trillion records. That's trillion with a T. Quite a few for each person on Earth. Now these data breaches always draw lots of press attention. We see them in the news, they're reported on television and the media. And they may be embarrassing for a business or management, somebody may lose their job, but for the IT teams, it's the stuff of nightmares, right? We worry about that. And as bad as most of us are concerned about being accountable or responsible for some data breach, imagine how the data subject feels, the person whose data it is, the person who the data describes. They may be concerned that, why does this company have so much data about them? Or they may not know that this particular company actually had their information. They may wonder why their data is being used, and certainly wonder if the company's retained it too long, especially if they've not used that account for some time or asked it to be deleted. I mean, it's bad enough to expose somebody's sensitive data, but it's worse if they had explicitly asked you to not send them marketing emails or they deleted their account or something else. Now, many of us design applications, we work with data. We often find that we mark data as deleted or we do a logical delete in the application, but it still exists in the database. And many users don't understand that, and they certainly don't like it. Now, most of these companies aren't incompetent, right? Most of us know that there are smart people at these companies. They architect and design secure environments. Many of us spend a lot of time and effort doing that. We implement and follow good processes that are designed to prevent leaks. People usually write good code. I know we could argue about that, and there's certainly problems and we can improve what we do, but we do tend to write good code, and we see less and less things like SQL injection over the years, but security isn't our top priority. It's something we think is important, but we don't spend time on it. We don't regularly schedule security testing as part of our deployment pipeline, or we don't regularly security test our code. We don't do pen testing of our systems. We know we need to patch our systems, our software, our libraries, but we often delay that or ignore it if developers can deliver some feature based on an old version of the library. We don't want to disrupt things. We don't want to spend time there. All of us know access controls are important, but not always. Right? We get pressured to share some data with a client, send it to another division of the company, something like that, and we decide, hey, let's use an S3 bucket, let's use a Dropbox folder. It's quick and easy, it's fast, we don't go through the entire ticketing process in our organization. All of us know that production data in QA is a bad idea, especially when it's sensitive, but we want to be sure that our business analysts, our clients, people that want to test our systems, can see data they understand, see the customers, see the clients, the orders, etc. So let's just restore production backup on QA. We know many data breaches come from inside an organization, but we find too often that people want to compromise security for convenience, especially within an organization. We know we've got firewalls. What does it hurt to share data inside the company? Now, the scale and scope of these data breaches continues to rise. And at this point in history, right, 50, 60 years into computing, I'd have thought that class action lawsuits or insurance companies would be forcing companies to actually make security a priority. Now, they haven't done that, but I think the tide is changing. Now, a few weeks ago when I saw that FedEx issue, I saw another article that talked about some poll results where they surveyed a number of consumers. And they do this every year, but for the first time, a majority of respondents actually rated security as more important than convenience. So it's not just that we want to get things done, but we want to do it securely. And it's not just individuals. We actually have governments that are starting to take note. So today our theme is data protection and privacy, and we want to talk a little bit about the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. That's here, taking effect here in the EU, and it's the European Union's latest way of trying to strengthen and unify all the data protection for its citizens. Now, one of the primary drivers behind the GDPR is to actually give people more control over how their personal data is used. The GDPR certainly supersedes previous legislation, much of which was enacted a long time ago, before the internet, before cloud technology, before we found all these new ways that we could actually exploit somebody's data. The GDPR was actually passed 2 years ago, May 4th, 2016. But we put a snooze button on it. So enforcement of the GDPR is actually going to take effect this year on May 25th, 2018. So that's the date we've got to be compliant. There are two things that kind of stand out about this legislation. One, GDPR isn't just for Europe. It applies globally to all organizations that are holding data about EU citizens. And two, the practices it outlines, the things that it asks you to do, they're things that every DBA worth their salt should be doing right now. If you want to read the GDPR text, it's available in plenty of places. We've got links on it from SQL Server Central and SimpleTalk and other places. We have a few articles at SQL Server Central. We try to explain it. Grant has been doing some blogging on his site, and he's got his YouTube channel to try to talk to you about the GDPR and data privacy and protection. There's guidance from various governments in the EU that will help you find the different things that you need to be concerned about. And if you have trouble sleeping at night, you could read all 99 articles of the 50,000 word document. Now, might not put you to sleep because I actually find it's much easier to read than most acts. It's fairly plain English, though it certainly can be confusing at times because it's a general law. It doesn't tell you specific things to do. It gives you guidance and a framework. Now, the primary principle that most organizations want to be concerned about in the GDPR is that any processing or handling of data needs clear consent from the data subject, the person about who the data refers. Organizations do have to be transparent about their practices. And maybe one change is we have to disclose the purpose why we're collecting and processing data. Of course, the data has to be accurate. If there are any mistakes, they have to be rectified without delay, which is something we'd like to do. But if you do correct data, you can't just edit in Management Studio. You have to have a record of any changes that you've made, right? Whether they're to correct something, fix something, or change something. You need to have a defensible position for your organization if you're going to alter data. Now, all these items are important because the GDPR will actually allow people to appoint an agent for legal action. So we'll get more group lawsuits, similar to the class action lawsuits that we have in the US. So it's something new for the EU and the UK. That's a change for many of us technicians. In our organizations, in the past, we've often assumed we own all the data. Every company I've worked for assumed that all that data in the database belonged to the organization. We could do anything we wanted with it. We could put it in applications, we could share it inside the organization. Anything we could do to extract value, to analyze it, learn more about it, we would do. We could sell that data. We could bundle it together, sell it to a third party. We could extract demographic information and sell that for machine learning or something else. Anything that would produce a profit. Security and protection for applications and data was often added later, or maybe not added at all. I've certainly been in organizations where we never secured any of the shares, we never secured any of the databases, and everybody had access. Most importantly, the penalties for any issues were fairly insignificant and weak for any size organization. There's a major change in the GDPR from previous laws because they tended to focus on the data from the perspective of the company. In the GDPR, the focus is on the individual's rights. Whether that's a live human or some legal entity like a corporation, they have rights over their data. And the GDPR wants to ensure that the data subject, the person who the data refers to, has some ability to enforce those rights. Now, maybe more importantly, the GDPR implements more serious penalties than any previous legislation. The penalties are designed to be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive to any misaction by a company. The upper limit is actually 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover. And for those of us in the US and other places, turnover is revenue. So 4% of global revenue, not profit, but revenue. Now these are maximums. And it's all likelihood that we won't see them assessed very often. They'll be held back for the most serious cases of data loss. And the thing to keep in mind is if you suffer a data breach, the fines are going to be based on whether you did everything you could to limit the impact of the data breach. That means you have to be prepared and ready and show that you've actually done something. You have to prove that you took appropriate precautions. Right now, the GDPR is affecting lots of companies. Certainly in the EU and the UK, it's a big deal. And the atmosphere here somewhat reminds me of 1999 when everyone was rapidly trying to change their systems to prepare for the Y2K change. The difference is now, it's not just a one-off. We've got to make changes that will take effect and exist in our company for perpetuity. They've got to be going forward. And any organization that does business in the EU or that monitors data about EU citizens, that handles it in any way, they're working right now to ensure that their systems are compliant, that they're assessing the impact or they're assessing the sensitivity of the data that they have. And this is true even if the data is about EU citizens that don't live in the EU. So if we have EU citizens in the US or elsewhere, this will apply. But what about those of us that don't do business in the EU, that we're outside? People in the US and Canada, Japan, elsewhere, do we have to worry about the GDPR? I mean, there's plenty of press, there's plenty of articles in the news that say we should be concerned. And we really should be. Now, I've got this great quote here that I think is applicable. And it says, the GDPR applies to any organization that holds or processes data on EU citizens, regardless of where it's headquartered. So any of us that are interacting in some way with the EU, conducting some sort of business, we certainly do have to be concerned. We're going to have data about EU citizens. GDPR is definitely going to apply to us, and most companies are preparing. Certainly lawyers and solicitors will sort out the actual impact, but in general it's going to apply to us. Microsoft is worried. They've got a section on their site where they have all sorts of information and guidance about the GDPR. They're using that internally to prepare for their own systems, and they're actually providing that information to customers as well. And that's what we're doing here today at Redgate. We want to talk to you about data privacy and protection. We want to help you be compliant for the GDPR. Now, internally, we're ensuring that our data handling here meets the guidance and spirit of the GDPR. Not everybody can access every database here any longer. And more importantly, we're building products to help you comply with the GDPR. And we're working with Microsoft to ensure that we use the same classifications, same verbiage, the same taxonomy that they are, so that we have a seamless interaction across all of their platforms. Now, if you don't do business in the EU or hold EU citizens' data, do you need to comply or do you need to be worried? I don't know. As I said, lawyers, solicitors, others will work that out, but I do think we should all embrace the principles of the GDPR. They're good principles, and other countries are enacting similar legislation. Japan has a law that's based on the GDPR. Australia is adding additional GDPR protections to their data privacy laws. China, US have draft items or revisions to standards like NIST that potentially could become legislation in the future. But the thing is, these are solid, well thought out principles that most of us as data professionals, we would just like to implement. They're the ideas that we would like to have in our own systems. In many ways, these guidelines are no different than things we already adhere to because of other regulation or other certifications that exist in our companies. Now, plenty of companies around the world do have to deal with other legislation, and they've often changed their process or implemented something to help them conform. For example, if you process credit card data, many of you know you have to adhere to PCI standards, which kind of a framework for how you should build your systems. If you do any medical processing in the US, you fall under the HIPAA laws. There are regulations in other countries that are similar. There's public companies in the US have to adhere to Sarbanes-Oxley, and there's other financial structures around the world where companies have to ensure that they comply. And then many organizations around the world voluntarily adhere to ISO certifications because it makes business easier, right? They can work with partners and they understand that they're adhering to a certain set of guidelines. If you work with any of these, chances are you're close to GDPR compliance. The difference is you now have to add the idea that the data subject's view matters. We have to look at their frame of reference. They have rights, and we have to enforce those. And these are rights that most of us would want for our own individual data. Now, in some sense, these preparations are similar to the Sarbanes-Oxley preparations that happened in the US. When that legislation passed, I worked at a company that had actually just completed our ISO recertification. I think it was ISO 9000 at that time. And we found that most of the work we had done for ISO compliance applied to Sarbanes-Oxley. And in fact, we merged those efforts together so that we didn't duplicate work. And we wanted to ensure that anything we did in the future, any of the documentation we had, applied to both ISO and Sarbanes-Oxley. And the same effort is happening now. There are companies that are worried about GDPR, and many of them are ISO 27001 compliant, and they're merging those efforts, and they're tweaking their ISO compliance to ensure that it works with the GDPR as well. Now, as a data professional, I've often felt that I'm responsible and I'm accountable for the systems and databases under my control. I don't own them, but I want to be sure that they're secure and protected. I want to ensure that the data is intact, that nothing changes it except authorized individuals or authorized systems. And if I have to move data, if I have to extract it or run reports, I want to do it in a secure way. I want to make sure that data is protected. I didn't want to make sure, or I don't want any production data in development or test systems. I know that sometimes that isn't always the case, but I want to be careful with it. And certainly I want to ensure that all new systems, databases, web servers, anything, that they're built and adhering to all the standards that we've decided are the best practices in our company. I'm sure plenty of you feel the same way. You want to ensure that all your systems are set up the way that you think that they work best, that they're secure, you're responsible, and you're accountable. And the GDPR really just asks that you do this in advance, not later. It wants you to think about security by design and by default. You want to build that in before you perform work, not afterwards. This asks that you just design the system from the ground up with security in the forefront. It's not something that we bolt on. And we want to make sure this isn't a checkbox, that we just set it and forget it. This is an ongoing practice. We want to make sure we're monitoring our systems and we're protecting our data moving forward. And that's what most of us want to do anyway in our databases. Now, the Equifax data breach occurred because there was an unpatched system on their web server and it allowed access to their databases. They knew about the patches, hadn't applied it. The FedEx database that was exposed was on a public Amazon S3 share. They hadn't secured it to individuals. And plenty of other data breaches occur because we have production data stored somewhere outside of a secure production system. Often it's an insecure, hastily built test development client system, something like that. Matter of fact, if we go over the largest data breaches in history, almost all of them have come about because of poor, sloppy, hasty actions taken inside of companies. Often because security isn't part of our initial thought process or design when we set something up. Certainly a few of these people might have been incompetent, but I've worked in lots of organizations, and often I find we're pressured to get work done, or we're in a hurry. We need to get something done quickly, and we set aside security or good practices just for the sake of expediency. Most of us never want to build a system without considering security from the get-go, and now GDPR allows us to push back on management, try to avoid all those silly mistakes. But that doesn't mean that we move slowly. It just means we have to move securely. Last 5, 6, 7 years, DevOps has been this hot topic. We see it in the news. More and more companies are talking about how they're adopting DevOps processes to deliver software quicker, to respond to all your business needs, your client requests, as soon as possible. And many of us are embracing those concepts now. Redgate has been working hard to help you include the database in the DevOps process. We want to make sure that you can package up your changes, that you can test them, you can deploy them the same way every time. And our practice and experience here at Redgate shows us that database DevOps is in line with what the GDPR is asking you to do. Now, in a recent survey we ran of a number of people, 64% of our respondents said that database DevOps had a positive impact on their data governance. That database DevOps helps you simplify your compliance in your development, your deployment, and your operations process. We give you something that's repeatable, reliable, and has an audit trail. DevOps is designed to kind of help us make sure the right process, the right task is performed in the right order every time, that it's consistent. Database DevOps ensures we've got repeatable, reliable processes that we can always count on. We're sure we can deploy those changes. And that's what we want to do in our data handling as well as our software. We want to make sure that we're reliable and repeatable. The DevOps also lets us learn from our previous efforts. We monitor our practices, we adjust them to become better at delivering software, right? Do more of what works, less of what doesn't. And part of that process is making sure that we build security in. There are DevSecOps and rugged DevOps practices that are designed to help companies deliver more secure software faster. Not designed to add overhead, not to slow us down, but to make our software, our process more secure and still work quickly. And they do this by incorporating security practices into the process, right? Ensure that it's in the basis of development when we're building software, in our test systems, in our deployment, and then monitoring our operational world afterwards. DevOps really wants us to adopt and incorporate new practices as we discover them in our efforts. And if we find something that doesn't work well, we take it out. We change those processes to make sure that it works. If we need to deliver a patch, we can do it. Now, DevOps wants to make smaller changes more often so that we can respond to needs. We get feedback and understand what features are useful to customers, but we also can update those old libraries. We often can ensure that if we learn something new about security, we can put it in our software. And we want to be aware of the data that we use, where it's located, and how customers access it, because that's important as well. Now, a large part of the GDPR is ensuring an organization knows where the databases are, what data is in them, how it's classified. And so we have to adopt that in our process as well. Doesn't mean that we can't let clients use Excel or manipulate data or download it or something else, but they can't do it without security. And business people have to be concerned about how they handle data. And that's something that we have to enable them as technologists. And fortunately, we're getting more and more tools that will help us do that. There's things like Power BI that allow business people to manipulate data in a more secure fashion, often because they can work with live data or cached data from databases rather than downloading extracts and having files living on shares and in different places. Now, there's definitely work you have to do to comply with GDPR, but you shouldn't be afraid. Don't view this as a bitter pill to swallow. Think of it as a sweet treat. It's a treat you wanted for a long time. You wanted to share with your organization, one that you hoped your management would embrace. The GDPR is a good idea. It asks for good, solid, proven practices to protect and secure our data. And it asks that we continue to monitor those processes over time to ensure we're compliant. If not, we adjust the process to correct issues. A lot of the GDPR is ensuring that you are doing what you know best, not taking shortcuts. Now, at Redgate, we're aligning our focus to ensure compliance for all your SQL Server databases from development to operations. We're working hard on solutions that will help prove your security throughout your software development pipeline. The great teams that build software know they need to include security in their software and in their databases. And we've been doing a lot of work in the areas of cloning, masking, protecting data to ensure that as you move data to non-production environments, it's still protected and secure. We want to ensure that as you're building software, as you're working with your databases, you can supply data to those developers, those testers, to QA environments that retains the characteristics of production, but not being production data, not being sensitive data that potentially could be released. We want to ensure that we've masked out or anonymized any sensitive data to prevent any accidental disclosures. Over the last year, we've been working on a number of products to help ensure that you can, in fact, better understand your entire data landscape and you can protect it as well. Now, we've recently introduced a SQL Provision Bundle, which includes SQL Clone and Data Masker. Last March, I got to introduce SQL Clone, which I think is a fantastic product. It would have really changed development for me if I'd had it a decade ago. And now we've bundled that with Data Masker, which is a fantastic thing I want to show you later. These products together will help you ensure that you adopt a DevOps process for your database that's quick and it's fast, but it's compliant. Now, we've also added SQL Provision to our SQL Data Privacy Suite. This is a number of products from Redgate, and it includes our new SQL State Manager, which you'll see a little bit later. We can map and manage your entire SQL data landscape so you understand things from the data protection standpoint, from the perspective of the GDPR. Where is my data? How is it classified? And how important is it? We want to make sure you know which databases it lives in, so we help with discovery. We want to make sure we know if it's PII data, sensitive or not. We want to make sure we protect it as it moves around, especially if it moves to non-production environments. And then, of course, we want to help you monitor this over time so that if there are any potential issues, if anything has changed in your system which could potentially allow data to be released, you're alerted right away. And that way you don't put any of your data at risk. So we've got a great day coming up today. We've got a lot more information in all these sessions. Later on, Grant's going to dive into some more details on data protection and privacy, and he'll talk about the specifics you'll see with GDPR, and he'll show you some of the ingeniously simple solutions we have here at Redgate. We'll look a little bit at versioning and automation and version control, deploying and packaging your changes with Tom Austin. He's going to look at the database DevOps process in more detail. And I'll get to come back this afternoon, and I'll talk to you about SQL Provision Suite, and I'll show you how SQL Clone and Data Masker work together to ensure that those non-production environments look like production, and they're just as large, but they're not in any way compromising the security. At the end of the day, we have Kathy and Ben Emmett. They're going to talk about monitoring and how you can deal with the challenges that you face every day in these large, complex environments, and especially how SQL Monitor can be used to help you. But now I'm going to step aside. My good friend Ike Ellis from California came all the way from San Diego into the snow here at Cambridge, and he is going to talk to you about some of the great habits of SQL Developer. So we'll be back in a few minutes with Ike. Thanks.